My name is MacKenzie. I'm the social worker at the Renal unit at the Ulster Hospital. I'd like to introduce a short film that may help to explain to some dialysis patients the value of using art while on dialysis. It's a very difficult treatment and occupies a lot of time in a patient's life. We'll be talking to two patients who've been through that journey before and have used art successfully, and you'll hear in the interview how it worked for them. And also talking to one of the renal consultants who can explain how the evidence is there now to support the use of art. Hope you enjoy this.
I'm Paul. I came on to dialysis quite quickly. I'd had kidney failure, but then my kidneys stopped very quickly. And it was quite a shock for me, both mentally and physically, just what dialysis was like. It did make a massive difference, but it was very hard for me at the start. And probably the mental bit was the hardest, in that I knew I was going to be attached to a dialysis machine 3 times a week for 4 hours each time. But again, that was what was saving my life at the time, and made a massive difference. But it is challenging in lots of different ways, mainly because you don't realise your kidneys do so many things within your body, and all those things are affected once they stop working.
I was taken into hospital in 2021 when I ended up in A&E with my lungs were at 93% capacity full of blood. Both my kidneys had died, my heart was damaged, because I was actually started coughing up blood. And then a friend who was with just said to me, "You need to go to hospital," and I was like, "I'll go to bed, it'll be all right." But then every time I was breathing, it sounded like somebody rumping a packet of crisps, so I knew as well myself things weren't too good. And then filled a pint glass full of blood by coughing it up, so I decided to go in A&E. And then while I was in A&E, they basically told me to plan my own funeral. So that things were that bad, so I actually ended up getting the minister up, planning my own funeral and stuff like that. And then I ended up being put into a coma, an induced coma. And when I came out of the coma, I had these strange wires sticking out of my neck like Frankenstein's monster. So that was my introduction to kidney dialysis through my neck. It started off taking the blood through the neck, because at the time I didn't know what was wrong or what was going wrong. But I ended up like a pretty special case, because it ended up they were having conferences in Newcastle, and all different, like lung specialists, kidney specialists, and all different specialists having all these meetings about me, what was always going wrong. So it took me a wee while to find out, but then that's when I was introduced to I found out that it was end-stage kidney disease.
Once I started dialysis, I found it very hard, especially around the first month or so. But after that, I began to realise that you could live with it, and it did make a massive difference. I'd always been interested in art and drawing and activities like that, and I began to realise that the way to look at dialysis for me, which helped, was to say, well, I've got 4 hours every day, 3 days a week, that I can then try to use. And what I started to do was do small watercolour sketches, gradually progressing to larger or medium-sized oil paintings, which actually helped lift my mood and in a way helped me escape from the dialysis unit to the locations that I was trying to draw or paint.
I took up art. When I first came across art was actually in a prison cell, and 23-hour lockup in a prison cell. I went to jail in 2013, so I bit of a bad coloured past sort of thing. Like, I got growing up in Northern Ireland, I got caught up with the rubbish that came along with Northern Ireland at the time. So, unfortunately, wasted most of my life being an agent running around and full of that rubbish, and then got a prison sentence. Done 2 prison sentences long term. So the second time I really wanted to change my life, and I said I just had enough of it. So I went in with the mindset that I was going to get educated, but I took up art, and education went out the window. So, but anyway, I took up art, so I'd done a lot of art, and actually worked as an artist in the art department in prison, and that's where I sort of relate to where dialysis. I didn't know until I started dialysis, but I can relate to being in prison and dialysis, because you're both confined to a small space for a long period of time. So the likes of art therapy, it can be like a therapy, but they don't really like to call it art therapy. But like the art in prison, and then while I was on dialysis, it had a massive impact. But I was a self-employed artist before I took ill, So it was, so I'd already been doing art, but if it wasn't for art, I don't know, I don't think I would have been able to cope going through dialysis, to be honest.
Starting craft or art activities while on dialysis did make a real difference to me quite quickly. It used up at least 2 hours of the 4 hours quite quickly, and I began to look forward to coming into dialysis because I had that protected time away from your family and kids, where you knew you could work on some drawings. Initially I would only do it for maybe half an hour, but then progressing up to about 2 hours. I found any more than that would get too tiring. But another interesting part of it was the figuring out how you were actually going to be able to carry out paintings without inconveniencing the staff. And also there was a lot of benefits in that other patients began to become a bit interested in what you were trying to do, and it lightened their day, and it gave you something to talk about throughout your dialysis session. So it was positive in a number of different ways for me. I think when you start painting or drawing in front of other people, that can be challenging. I had come from an art background and had always been really doing it, so that part for me wasn't as much of a challenge. But it takes you a wee while to get used to it, but that's why I started off with small sketches and not really expecting anything too much. But gradually, after a few weeks, the quality of my working in here began to improve. And that's what I would say to people, is that even if you're not sketching, there's a lot of free tutorials online, either using YouTube or whatever, that through the hospital Wi-Fi system you can access while you're in your hospital bed. So even if you're not actually sketching at the time in the unit, you can follow a lot of different artists or painters from around the world, which was what I started doing. Maybe when I wasn't painting, I could be watching a lesson given by somebody in England, somebody giving it in California, or a painter working in the outback in Australia was one of the favourite guys I like to watch each week. So it definitely has benefits, and being able to use them while you're in your hospital bed, it gives you a kind of freedom from your dialysis, and you can try to use the period on dialysis positively. Trying to adapt while you're on the dialysis machine can be hard, but I used to enjoy prepping my materials and equipment before I came to dialysis and trying to plan how I was going to carry out the sketches or paintings. And if you do a wee bit of thought before it, you can work it out, and that becomes part of the challenge as well, where in my case I had a fistula in my left arm, so all I could really use my left arm for was either for holding paintbrushes or holding a tube of paint or a Pritt stick of glue. So even if you're doing quite restrictive things, if you can work around those, it becomes actually in some respects more interesting, because you're having to work with limited resources, and sometimes it makes your brain become a bit more creative, and you can produce very good work if you just plan and take your time. So although it's a challenge, it brought some interesting outcomes sometimes because of the restrictions.
When you talk to somebody about art, the first thing they say is, I can't draw a stick man. But art covers so many different ways. You have abstract art, which is more or less it's not like, it's just like expressing yourself on canvas. But everybody has their own unique, different way of expressing themselves. So art can be for everyone. You just have to find your different genre of art, or what you prefer. But creative writing, songwriting, music, poetry, creative ceramics, visual artists. So there's so many different types of art that there always is some, but that's really, really good for the head. But what I find too as well, especially was a big impact on me, was when I was in prison. Like, we used to have an afternoon class, and we called it the headers class, but it was just people who had never done art before, and they come down and they'd give art a go for their first time, and see, once they've done their first piece of art, and that sense of achievement, it kept them going, and it gave them a hobby. Like, I was lucky enough, I got a career out of it, but a lot of people got a hobby, which was really good for their mental health and state of mind. So, like, for dialysis patients too, it could be really, really beneficial.
We do know from evidence that diversionary activities especially during therapies like dialysis, where you're in the one place for 4.5 hours, 3 times a week, every week, for perhaps a very long period of time. These activities can actually help a sense of well-being, and that in turn I think is terribly important when we're looking at patients' experience of attending our unit. It's been a real privilege, it's been really exciting working with Ulster and with Stephen and Paul on this venture. We're committed in the dialysis unit here to both quality, the experience of the patients and the safety of what we do, but I think what Stephen and Paul have pointed towards is a different metric by which we can measure ourselves. We know that we provide quality dialysis, and that's evidenced by national registry data, and it's also evidenced by the patient reported outcome measures, which is a national survey of patient experience. But I think what Stephen and Paul have shown here is that the impossible can be made possible, and what they've shown I think is an inspiration both to not just to other patients but to the staff and maybe beyond that as to how you can overcome challenges. So I'm really looking forward to how we're going to develop this and scale it up across the unit.